This is the story of a medieval mystery, a riddle centuries old. It is bound up with the magic and alchemy of Europe in the Middle Ages. Imagine a book which no one can read, a manuscript in a language no one can speak. It is both priceless and worthless. It came from the old world and lives in the new. It has made fools of the wise, yet its own wisdom is folly. That book is the Voynich manuscript.
I first heard about the Voynich manuscript when I was at my aunt's funeral. And I knew nothing about the manuscript and was intrigued. Got back home, switched on the net, and there were all a flood of information about this amazing, mysterious manuscript. And I got quite hooked.
It's just a bizarre manuscript that has pictures of what they call naked nymphs in really strange scenes, weird botanical drawings, and an alphabet that's never been seen before.
Everyone in my family kind of grew up knowing about the Voynich manuscript. It was an obsession of my father's from back before any of us were born, and it kind of stayed a household word.
My personal fascination in the Voynich is that it is a puzzle.
There's text, there's diagrams, there's astrology, there's cosmology, all kinds of things all at once. And it's very easy to say what it isn't. And it's very difficult to say what it is.
For years, the Voynich manuscript has taunted and tantalized the experts. It remains the most mysterious book in the world.
A couple of years ago, at my aunt's funeral, her grandson came up to me and said, "Did you know you were related to Wilfrid Voynich?" He said that Wilfrid had discovered this amazing manuscript that no one had ever deciphered. It was just this elegant enigma waiting to be decrypted. But he didn't actually fill in very much at all at the time. He just said, "Go and have a look, it's fascinating." So I did.
The challenge of solving the Voynich mystery has become an international obsession, and its appearance on the internet has made it all the more enticing. Jerry Kennedy's chance encounter at his aunt's funeral drew him into the Voynich spell. At first, he was attracted not so much by the manuscript itself, but by the extraordinary life of Wilfrid Voynich, his distant relative from Poland.
Wilfrid Voynich was a really intriguing guy, a lovable rogue, I think, would typify him, but someone who led an incredibly interesting life.
Voynich arrived in London in 1890, an exile from mainland Europe. He had barely a penny in his pocket, and yet within a few years he was doing lucrative business.
Quite magically, Wilfrid, from nowhere, seemed to conjure up this amazing antiquarian bookshop deal.
Although he had no apparent literary expertise, he set up an antiquarian bookshop in central London, which soon made him a rich man.
But he was very successful very quickly and set up an office in Shaftesbury Avenue in London and a couple of others in Europe, and traded very well.
He built his reputation by laying his hands on books which other dealers never spotted. Customers would request a rare volume, and Voynich, almost magically, would track it down, however far the search took him.
He wasn't one of these guys who would just go to auctions and bid for stuff. He used to go out searching. He was a hunter. He'd go off wandering around Europe looking for stuff. And it was on one of these searches of his, he ended up in Italy, south of Rome, in a place called Frascati, in the Villa Mondragone in 1912.
The Villa Mondragone was a Jesuit college in urgent need of restoration. The Jesuits were selling off part of their library to raise money. It was just the opportunity Voynich relished. An uncatalogued collection which, if he got in first, could dazzle his customers. As Voynich started poking around the old monastery, he stumbled across an old chest half filled with books. The manuscripts inside were finely illustrated and certainly good for business. But then his eyes lit on something else. Voynich knew immediately he'd found something special. Back in London, he wrote in great excitement about his discovery.
It was such an ugly duckling compared with the other manuscripts, with their rich decorations and golden colors, that my interest was aroused at once. I found that it was written entirely in cipher.
Voynich never told anyone where he'd found his ugly duckling. He became fascinated, as hundreds of others have been since, by trying to work out what it was. Every now and then, words in the cipher would look familiar. He could see patterns in the script. But then the flashes of illumination would fade, and Voynich was left none the wiser.
There are only 3 known documents from, say, pre-1500 that are completely in cipher, and this is one of them. And the other 2 are very simple cipher, so it's very, very unique.
It wasn't just the script that was unique. On nearly all the 235 pages were strange and crudely drawn illustrations, a far cry from the pious designs of most medieval manuscripts. The Jesuits at the Villa Mondragone had given Voynich no clue as to how the book had fallen into their hands. Now, almost 100 years later, it's in the custody of the Americans at the Voynich Rare Books Library in Yale University. It can only be seen by special permission and can never leave the building. Despite its splendid isolation, Voynich enthusiasts the world over have been drawn to its enigma. One of them is a New Jersey mathematician and cryptographer, Jim Reeds. He first got hooked almost 40 years ago.
I saw it as a challenge. It was a chance to, well, I was a kid. It was a chance to prove sort of how smart I was. This would be like figuring out Egyptian hieroglyphics, something of that sort.
The Voynich alphabet has between 23 and 30 characters, depending on whether you count the composite letters, where some of the smaller characters are combined. So it's the same sort of size as European alphabets. But the vocabulary is very limited, and many words differ from each other by just 1 or 2 letters. Jim Reeds has thrown all his analytical expertise at the puzzle.
I tried figuring out what the range of letter shapes was, tried to do frequency counts, tried to test out hypotheses such as the most common character, maybe it meant an E or an A, tried to see if I could deduce what symbols might stand for vowels and which consonants, because vowels sort of tend to sit next to consonants and consonants sit next to vowels. I tried fitting zodiac names to some of the characters in those zodiac diagrams. So I guess I've been working on the Voynich manuscript off and on in this way for more than 30 years.
Voynich himself fared no better. After 2 years' effort, he moved his business to New York at the outbreak of the First World War. He took his precious manuscript with him, hopeful he could find an American expert to help him.
I knew practically nothing about ciphers, and therefore I endeavored to awaken the interest of specialists in this volume. All without success, except for Professor William Romaine Newbold.
So Newbold was destined to be the next person ensnared by the Voynich manuscript. He was a philosopher and during the war a cryptographer for the American government. The two men were to spend the next 10 years wrestling with the riddle.
Newbold somehow thought that a system of shorthand was at work, that what ordinary people would think of as a written O, Newbold would look at through the magnifying glass and see that, in fact, it was composed of a dozen little separate, little tiny letters, sort of micro letters, if you will. So he would analyze each Voynich manuscript letter into these micro letters. And each microletter had a little meaning of its own. And then Newbold had a system of permuting the microletters around and reinterpreting them in pairs and hooking them up. It was quite complex. And then he finally came out with a text.
As Voynich watched Newbold unravel the code, he was convinced a Nobel Prize was within their grasp. The manuscript, according to Newbold's thesis, was written in Latin.
Newbold, I think, was very excited about this, and he sent telegrams to, the Yale Library has a copy of a very excited telegram from Newbold to Voynich saying, I've solved it, I've solved it. He's feeling quite pleased with himself.
But the next challenge was to date the book, and that's always been contentious. The simple solution today would be to carbon date it. But the Beinecke Library at Yale University has always refused to allow this, so there's no scientific way to prove when it was written. However, the book itself does offer some clues to its probable date. Nick Pelling is a computer games programmer from Surbiton who's been collecting the evidence. It seems to confirm a close link with Italy in the 15th century.
You had a collection of fragmented city-states, each with what you call warlords now. And as well as fighting each other, they also traded with each other and communicated with each other. And cryptography was the glue that held it together, because messages had to be secret.
And the intense competition in code making in 15th century Italy may explain why the Voynich code is so tough to crack.
Italy was an arms race for cryptography, where you had lots of people creating codes, breaking codes, creating new codes, breaking those codes, and again and again and again. The complexity of codes going up and up and up through the century.
This collection of codes used in Italy at the time shows just how important cryptography was, and intriguingly, 3 of them use one of the characters that appear in the Voynich manuscript, the one that looks like a 4-0. It's a character that Nick Pelling has found nowhere else.
It's very tantalising that purely on that thing you could date it to say 1450 to 1460.
But if this picture in the Voynich manuscript is of a sunflower, it was not known in Europe until 1493, when Columbus brought it from America. Whatever the finer arguments, Nick Pelling says there's one other tiny clue pointing to the 1400s.
I've studied the castle in the map page quite a lot. The castle is almost certainly a 15th century northern Italian castle. There were plenty like it. Plenty got knocked down and rebuilt. It's very, very hard to trace it.
It all fits in with the general view that the manuscript is 15th century and Italian. However, there was one man who thought differently, and that was Wilfrid Voynich himself. Voynich had another critical piece of evidence which led him to believe the book had been written more than 200 years earlier than this. A letter tucked inside the manuscript. The letter was written in Prague on the 19th of August 1666 and was addressed to Athanasius Kircher, a well-known scholar, asking him to decipher the book. The letter writer went on to mention that the manuscript might have been written by Roger Bacon, the 13th century English friar. Roger Bacon was one of the most renowned mathematicians and scientists of the Middle Ages. So this set Voynich's pulse racing. If Bacon were indeed the author of the manuscript, it would be the discovery of a lifetime. In Voynich's mind, Roger Bacon and a book in code belonged together.
An infinitely great scholar, he himself referred in his works the necessity of hiding his great secrets in the cipher.
I believe that Voynich suggested the idea to Newbold that it was written by Roger Bacon. But this thought to be written by Roger Bacon got converted into a dead certainty that it was by Roger Bacon.
Their imagination really ran away with them when they studied the illustrations. Newbold thought he could identify spiral nebulae in outer space, and pictures of human sperm, fallopian tubes, and fertilized human eggs. He and Voynich didn't pause for a moment's thought. They were convinced they were rewriting the history of science.
Bacon, if he had written this manuscript, if these pictures were truly pictures of the Andromeda Nebula, of things seen in the microscope, well, that meant that Bacon would have seen these things which we can only see with telescopes, with microscopes, things that weren't invented until centuries after Bacon did. That would have meant that Bacon would have had to have invented the microscope himself hundreds of years before it was actually invented.
Voynich thought his fortune was made. He gave the book a price tag of $160,000, making it one of the most expensive books ever to go on sale.
It will produce such a sensation that Newbold will become famous, and I rich, and half famous. I wish you could see the excitement of the professor and his wife. They danced, they embraced each other and me. They became ill, delirious.
Voynich and Newbold put the manuscript on public display, and newspapers leapt on the story. But no one actually bought it.
It took about 10 years before people realized that this was all complete baloney, and that what Newbold was thought of as these little micro letters was really just the ink cracking, a perfectly ordinary process.
Newbold admitted that his method of deciphering the script had been inconsistent, and once his text was proved wrong, the idea that Bacon was the author also lost credibility. Newbold's reputation was in tatters, and he died a broken man. But the way the Voynich manuscript humiliated an expert of Newbold's stature hasn't discouraged others. Big Jim Finn from North Carolina, for instance, has been looking at the same pictures as Professor Newbold and has reached even more radical conclusions.
Well, my opinion differs from everyone else because of one picture in the manuscript. There is a picture that I saw that when I looked at it, I said, nah, can't be. And I actually set that picture up as wallpaper on my computer, and I spent time just staring at it. It looked like a depiction, an artist's rendering of probably our galaxy.
But how did an author 500 years ago visualize the Milky Way? Big Jim has the answer.
I believe the person that wrote the manuscript was contacted by extraterrestrials. I believe that the extraterrestrials were telling the author hidden information concerning the destruction of the world, which was yet to come.
And the naked nymphs and the botanical drawings play their part in his apocalyptic vision.
As far as the plants in the Voynich, I honestly don't know. That is out of my area. Based on the rhetoric that I've listened to, I think they're put there for a distraction. I think that those and the pictures of the so-called naked nymphs were put there as a distraction to keep certain people out of the manuscript. It's part of the encoding. It's part of the wall building.
With the outbreak of the Second World War, the science of cryptography rose to new heights, and the Voynich sleuths were off again. The Americans cracked the infamous Purple Cipher, a major breakthrough into Japanese intelligence. The brains behind that belonged to William Friedman. It would have been a tough enough job for most people, but towards the end of the war, Friedman looked for a little light relief from his day job and began to toy with the Voynich code.
William Friedman was the top American codebreaker in the period 1920s through 1950s. He was the technical director of the National Security Agency in America, the equivalent of the GCHQ.
Friedman pulled in 16 other top brains to tackle the Voynich enigma.
I mean, if they gave Nobel Prizes in codebreaking, these people would have Nobel Prizes. And they thought the Voynich manuscript was worth working on.
But after more than a year's work, Friedman and his team realized they were getting nowhere. At the end of the war, the code-breaking team surrendered. They'd been defeated by the Voynich manuscript. It was to be over 20 years before the next serious attempt on the mysterious medieval code. Robert Brumbaugh was a mathematics professor at Yale University. He was sure he could find the key where others had failed, and he recruited his son and daughter to help him.
I'd say the first thing that strikes everybody is that it looks very easy. It's got fascinating little pictures, diagrams, labels, and a cipher that looks as if you should be able to sit down and piece together what it's saying in a day's work.
Robert Brumbaugh Sr. thought there must be a basic clue which others before him had overlooked. He wanted to get into the medieval mindset of the author, and he thought he knew how.
Our father thought that he could recognize in this cipher in the Voynich a pattern that he had seen in numerology and that magical tradition in some manuscripts. I thought he understood what kind of a cipher was being used, and that also explained why it wouldn't have been apparent to the military code experts who had worked on it before. It was a very different kind of approach to enciphering. He used that idea based on what he'd seen in some other manuscripts, began to get readings that were plausible for some of the text in the Voynich, and he was convinced that he was on the right track to reading it.
Brumber applied numerical equivalents to the alphabet, with each number from 1 to 9 representing 2 or 3 letters. By taking the word beside the picture of a plant in the manuscript, Brumber applied his code.
Each of these symbols used to write the Voynich represents a number. Each of those numbers represents one of 3 letters. And we showed that you can write a message in that cipher and read it off again without a great deal of ambiguity.
Paparicus, plausibly paprika. It looks like some sort of pepperish plant, and it's on the folio with other pepper-related plants. So that seems like a reasonable reading for that label.
This method worked for a few words, but the rest remained a riddle. Years of work were getting him nowhere.
In the end, our mother it was really our mother that insisted our father had to stop, that he'd gone far enough, and that this had never been more than a sideline. And it has the power to draw people into it. He had other work that he wanted to spend the end of his life doing, and in fact he did.
This cycle of failure hasn't discouraged modern experts. But after 40 years, Jim Reeds is still as baffled as ever.
I've come to the point where nothing that I've tried seems to have worked, so maybe I'm not so sure anymore that it's a code.
Perhaps it really isn't a code at all. It could be a language of its own. 2 enthusiasts, René Zandbergen from Germany and Gabriel Landini from Uruguay, met up after studying the Voynich manuscript on the internet. They've given it linguistic scrutiny. Each language has its own pattern according to the frequency of letters, even Voynichese.
And you can do this with very different languages, and you will see each language has its own different look. And you can do it with a Voynich manuscript, but it's not the same as any known language like English or Latin. However, it looks realistic. It doesn't look like something that came out of a hat.
Voynichese has its own pattern, but there's no clear match with any other language pattern. That suggests that if it is a code, it's not based on any known language. Perhaps it is, therefore, a language in its own right. Or a form of shorthand, which might explain the curiously short length of most Voynichese words.
Shorthand, or stenographers, essentially had to write very fast, and the script bears a lot of similarities with shorthands. So that could well be this kind of quick writing, form quick writing.
And if you don't know the rules of how to read shorthand, even the most mundane words can appear mysterious. But there is one further problem which adds to the riddle.
Another puzzling item in the Voynich manuscript is the fact that words tend to repeat, so the same word can be written 2, 3, or even 4 times in a row. The most puzzling part of this is actually that the most frequent word in the language of the Voynich manuscript can also be repeated. This is like having in an English text the most frequent word, which is the word the, twice in a row. And I cannot imagine any situation where one would say the. So this is also not explained.
It seems like another dead end. Back in the 1920s, Voynich still hadn't found a buyer for his manuscript. His theories about its origins and meaning had been discredited, and his business was floundering. So was his reputation.
3 to 4 dealers have opened a regular campaign of slander and abuse of my books. Every day, I'm worrying where I shall squeeze few $100s from clients. Last month, I had no cash at all to run the office or to live. Was obliged to borrow.
And he kept saying that the big smash is coming. The only way out of this is the provenance of the Voynich manuscript. So he clearly had, an academic interest in it, but he clearly also had a very strong financial interest.
But that letter he'd found tucked inside the book has kept the Voynich trail warm. It suggested the manuscript had been passed around Europe, changing hands frequently. For most of the time, its owners are shrouded in mystery, just like the author. But the letter pinpoints one owner of the book in the early 17th century, Emperor Rudolf II in Prague. And the emperor's involvement gives us some more clues, according to a retired science teacher from London, Tim Mervyn. It suggests the Voynich manuscript was caught up in the world of magic and the supernatural.
Emperor Rudolf was the Holy Roman Emperor. He ruled over large tracts of land in Germany and in Bohemia. He was interested in astrology. He was interested in all sorts of occult artifacts, books, manuscripts, and a number of other topics. One topic he was particularly interested in as well was the study of herbals, pharmacology.
Emperor Rudolf was just stark, raving mad. A lovely guy, I'm sure, but was basically mad. He invited all the alchemists of Europe to come to his court and gave them lodgings and places to work and workshops and things. And if they couldn't produce what he wanted, he killed them or threw them out.
Two of these visitors to Emperor Rudolph's court were from England, Edward Kelly and John Dee.
Well, Dee described himself as the Queen's philosopher. He regarded himself as a very serious scholar in a number of different areas, and he was a very religious man.
His sidekick Kelly, however, was a known charlatan, but had insinuated himself into Dee's company.
Kelly was a confidence trickster who persuaded a number of people that he could manufacture gold. He was an alchemist.
Dee and Kelly arrived at the court of Emperor Rudolf, hoping for his patronage. They'd brought with them some artifacts they thought would interest him, including perhaps the Voynich manuscript. Nick Pelling thinks he spotted a telltale sign that it had been in Dee and Kelly's hands before the Emperor's. The clue lies in the page numbering in the top and bottom right-hand corners.
The bottom right has been identified with John Dee's handwriting, and which is quite interesting. Whether John Dee was owner or not, it seems he probably was.
But the writing of the page numbers at the top seems different again.
I compared the Voynich with one of the documents in the British Library, and I'm pretty sure it's Edward Kelly's handwriting. Both numbers fail in the same way. As he gets tired, the writing becomes more sloppy as it goes along.
This suggests Dee and Kelly owned the manuscript at some point. Perhaps it consisted of loose pages, which they collated into the book form we have now. But what seems to link Dee and Kelly even more closely to the Voynich manuscript is the seances they held. Dee may have had high academic standing, but Kelly had convinced him that he could communicate with angels, and therefore with God. Through Kelly's angelic conversations, Dee desperately hoped he would discover divine secrets, secrets of the universe. At their seances, Kelly gazed into a crystal ball and voiced the message of the angels. Dee furiously wrote down Kelly's weird sounds, transcribing them into a language known as Enochian. But there are striking similarities between Dee's Enochian transcriptions and the Voynich script. And this could mean that Voynichese is also a strange angelic language. Perhaps it was written down by someone in a religious trance, speaking in tongues.
The theory that it's kind of speaking in tongues is a very plausible theory because it looks like a language, but it's not.
Monks and nuns in the Middle Ages would sometimes make themselves hallucinate as a way of communicating with God. Some of them took potions from poisonous mushrooms. St. Hildegard did it by starving herself before writing a coded manuscript. The problem with all this is that there are no apparent religious symbols in the book, apart from one cross. It makes it unlikely that it was written by a monk or a nun. But if the author was challenging the doctrines of the Church, he might have needed to protect himself. And one of the main anti-religious activities of the time was the study of alchemy. One specialist in medieval alchemy and magic, Peter Forshaw, believes the Voynich manuscript is connected with this world.
A major reason for people writing in code is the danger of their studies. The Church was very fond of burning people. One possibility for the Voynich being written in code is that it could be alchemical. Various people have suggested that it could be alchemical secrets which people wanted to keep secret from either other people researching in the field because these secrets were extremely precious. I mean, the suggestion is, for example, the elixir of life. One danger with elixirs is that if you are not careful with making any form of medicine, use too much of one ingredient, you kill the person. So one reason could just be safety rather than secrecy on the level of conspiracy.
But alchemy wasn't just a blend of magic potions and spiritualism. It was the forerunner to modern chemistry and central to medieval medicine. Medicinal remedies were made from herbs and plants, and the pages of the Voynich manuscript are filled with strange botanical pictures. Perhaps it was a medical manual for tackling killer diseases like the pox and the plague. We took a copy of the Voynich manuscript to a herbalist practice in London, modern-day medicinal alchemists, to see what light they could shed on it.
It does look like it's a herbal, like it's describing plants probably for medicinal use, because there's pages with the plant illustrations, and then at the back there's what seems to be instructions for preparing herbs.
I also suspect that there's an element in these images, the way that the plants are depicted, which is to do with memory. Because of the exaggeration of certain elements could be aide-memoirs and prompts to actually what you'd identify out in the field. So they exaggerate the size of certain fruits, certain leaves, which would be a key factor in actually identifying that plant out in the wild.
Previous analysis of the botanical drawings has failed to identify them. With their exaggerated and distorted roots and flowers, the pictures have generally been dismissed as unspecific and otherworldly. But the London herbalists believe that the medicinally significant part of each plant, the root, leaf or flower, has been drawn in an exaggerated way to indicate its potency. And they did recognize some of the Voynich plants.
We think this is thyme. It looks very much like thyme, the way that the stems are arranged, the small leaves. Have we got some thyme? Yeah. There's some thyme and there's your picture. So that's similar. This looks very much like Viola tricolor heartsease, which we've got a pot of here. What you can see in the flowers, the 5-petaled flowers with the one large petal at the top and 2 little pale ones underneath.
This could have been used for the lungs, for expectoration, and also for inflammation with the skin.
There, that's a water lily. You've got the great big flat leaf and then the lotus-like flower and its big tuberous root. What's that used for? Heart remedy, isn't it?
Other details start to make sense. This little dragon beside a plant could indicate that the plant had cooling properties to counteract a fever or the hot breath of a dragon. The man lying down beside this plant could mean it's a sedative or even poisonous. And the herbalists also make sense of some of the other Voynich pictures. They think the naked nymphs have more to do with gynecology than mythology.
What these images suggest to me are things such as the female reproductive system and fluids that are actually passing between those organs and tissue. There are also elements here that are very suggestive of the intestines. These other areas are very reminiscent of the urinary tract, and actually reservoirs such as the bladder and the like, and the kidneys. And again, we've got images of female figures which could be symbolic of some type of processing of fluids. Fluids being particularly associated with females and perhaps the moon, and this is another area where the astrological aspects could fit in.
The herbal may be connected with other medicinal things such as contraception or abortifacients, and that may be connected to why it could be written in code, because those sorts of things would have been proscribed by the church. So somebody dealing in those matters would have wanted to keep it quite secret. And that would also link into the pictures of women that are in the book. So that is a possibility.
The idea that the author of the Voynich manuscript could have been a medieval herbalist with heretical ideas about biology and contraception never occurred to Wilfrid Voynich. The book, which he tried to sell for $160,000, had brought him no reward. Instead, it had cost him almost 20 years of anguish, and his business had failed. In 1930, Voynich died. His ugly duckling had apparently outwitted him. But the Voynich mystery was far from over. He left the manuscript to his wife, and it was eventually sold to Hans Krauss, a well-known New York book dealer, for only $25,000. Krauss, once again, valued it at $160,000. But like Voynich, he couldn't find a buyer.
Maybe we asked too much money if we didn't ask any more than Mr. Voynich had asked. But there was just nobody who seemed to have either the money or the interest for it.
Eventually, the Krausses donated it to the Voynich Library at Yale, where it still is today, its riddle intact. And it's still shrouded in mystery. The library is very reluctant to give people access to it.
Yale University don't seem to me have been terribly cooperative in opening up the Voynich manuscript for research purposes, to test the inks, to test the vellum. And I suspect this is partly because there was also some years ago, and still an ongoing scandal about another hoax that was possible over the Vinland map.
This purported to be a 15th century map of North America based on exploration by Vikings centuries before Columbus. But tests on the ink showed it was a hoax.
They were left with egg on their face, rather, Yale University, and I suspect they don't want the Voynich manuscript to become another cause célèbre.
I think that the idea that the whole thing might be a sham is very frightening because, one, I don't want that to be true at all. I just want it to be something people can break. More people have had the same sensation. It just looks like something that you should be able to read. And the amount of effort that went into creating it just suggests some kind of rationale behind it other than pure fancy and a hoax on the world.
On the other hand, and this is what we always feel, everybody feels, you look at this, you think, oh, this doesn't look like a forgery or a hoax. A good hoax isn't supposed to look like a hoax.
If the Voynich manuscript is nothing more than a hoax, who might the suspects be? Who would have had the ability and the motivation to concoct such an elaborate trick?
Some people have suggested as culprits John Dee and Edward Kelly, partly because Dee and Kelly are famous or notorious for their angelic conversations, particularly Edward Kelly, who was notorious. It was rumoured that he was a crook. He pretended to be both an alchemist and tried to get famous patrons to give him a lot of money to reveal his secrets. And also people suspected that in fact his angelic conversations were just improvised on the spot to please whoever was listening.
Kelly was a supreme con artist. He was probably the greatest con artist in English history. He was a man who was unscrupulous. We have record of him committing the most foul acts to get his way.
Perhaps Kelly used his colleague John Dee to get access to Emperor Rudolph's court. He wanted the emperor's financial backing, so he needed to entrap him with some irresistible bait.
What we must remember is that Kelly wanted a document, a manuscript, that would intrigue people who saw it. He wasn't particularly concerned that it have a meaning. It just had to look good. It had to look like a language that the angels might have been speaking.
Kelly was a hoaxer, it's true, but the Voynich seems out of his league. He was more like a magician. He was more like a Uri Geller of his day, rather than anything else. But as for sitting down and composing a 200-plus page cipher manuscript, not really his style.
While Voynich was alive, he'd been dogged by whisperings that his precious book was a hoax. And that's partly why he found it so hard to sell. But there is a much more damaging possibility. That Voynich knew it was a hoax. It was a modern hoax, and the hoaxer was none other than Wilfrid Voynich himself.
When you think about it, there's an awful lot of just sort of weird, circumstantial notions that one might entertain about it. I mean, for a start, the only evidence we have about it is in 1666, and it disappeared completely, and no record of it whatsoever, despite the fact that it was being held in the library, allegedly, of this famous Jesuit scholar. And I thought that was a bit strange. So when you start looking in again, there are other incongruences, odd small details.
Why, for instance, was Voynich always so secretive about where he'd found the manuscript? He himself always said he was protecting his source because he'd hoped to acquire more of the Jesuits' library. His account of his visit to the Villa Mondrigoni was only revealed after his death. there was something else besides.
Most of the documents that Voynich sold on, that he discovered in the Villa Mondragone, had a little notice on them saying they'd come from this library, the library of this guy, Petrus Beck's, from around about 1870, when the Jesuits' libraries were all reorganised in Italy. The one that didn't have this on was the Voynich manuscript.
Wilfrid Voynich had been more than just a lovable rogue. He may have had an extra motive for forgery as a result of his checkered past. As a chemistry student in Warsaw, the young Voynich had been an active member of the Free Russia movement, the fight for Polish independence from Tsarist Russia. He was arrested and sent to prison in Siberia. But he escaped. He adopted a forged passport and an assumed name and made his way to London. He was still a political radical and came under the scrutiny of MI5, who thought he was using his antiquarian bookshop as a front to raise funds for the Free Russia movement.
We know that Voynich had been forging official documents that he needed for his underground activities. He also had access to vellum. If that's the one thing you're going to need if you're going to do a forgery, you're going to need some of the raw material. And it's documented that on his forays into Europe collecting books, he'd come across, obviously, blank vellum, which would at least give him one essential ingredient for a forgery.
And what's more, he may well have been in league with one of Britain's most infamous spies, Sidney Riley.
There are a number of interesting congruences between Riley and Voynich. They're both born in Lithuania, and they could possibly have known each other through a connection between Riley's cousin in this small town I forget the name of the small town in Lithuania. They both shared the same solicitor. They both had degrees in chemistry. They were both interested in medieval manuscripts. Riley also was interested in books too. And they were both involved in this underground organisation.
MI5 and the Russian secret police, the Okhrana, had files on both Riley and Voynich. Perhaps they pooled their talents to create a mysterious manuscript to fool the world.
Riley had been involved in all sorts of forgery deals. He'd interestingly been going to the British Library and getting out books on medieval pigments, medieval inks. Voynich too had been going to the British Library. We're not quite sure yet what he'd come up and what he was actually interested in at the time. And it just seems a little bit suspicious that they were both in dodgy characters, really. I mean, Voynich may well have been the activities he had on the side, as it were, that the Okhrana were interested in, were some of them, were legitimate. He was involved in laundering money in order to help this underground organisation. But it may also be, and this is all I'm suggesting, is that seeing as the two knew each other, that there may be some tie-up here, that all those congruences, if you add them up together, look a little bit suspicious, and it makes Wilfrid Voynich look not quite so squeaky clean as the Voynich circle so far have assumed.
In fact, Wilfrid Voynich may never have discovered the manuscript at all.
It's possible that in the Villa Mondragone in 1912, in amongst other manuscripts, Wilfrid may have come across this letter, a genuine letter, which indicated that an interesting document was around which had been sent to this scholar, Jesuit scholar, Athanasius Kircher, and mentioned that it was indecipherable, that it had herbs in it, pictures of it, that there was astrological stuff. Now, it may be that Voynich actually came across this letter in the Villa Mondragone in 1912 and thought, here is the crib, here is a cue for something that I could then turn into a hoax, and if I'm going to go for it, I might as well go for something big.
Perhaps it was too big. It certainly backfired. He never got a penny for his pains, and it cost him his reputation.
And I'm suggesting, I suppose, that he could have tailor-made with all this access to his knowledge, to vellum, to this document, and his network known worldwide with his authority, and all add in his lovable rogue charms, and the fact that he was totally skint. If you add all these things together, it seems to me no more than a possibility that's certainly worth investigating, that the whole of the Voynich manuscript may have been a hoax.
But there's a recent development which could help rescue Voynich from the charge of fraud. Deep within the archives of a Gregorian college in Rome, hidden among shelf after shelf of ancient manuscripts, another letter has come to light. Just like the letter that Voynich had found inside the manuscript, it's addressed to the scholar Athanasius Kircher, but dated a year later. In Latin, the letter writer asked Kircher whether he could convert these characters of unknown creation to known letters. It also describes herbs, stars, and chemical secrets. He seems to be describing the Voynich manuscript.
These are letters that are kept in a collection that were not accessible to Voynich. They essentially prove that a mysterious book that exactly fits the description of the Voynich manuscript existed in Prague at the time when it should have. So there's absolutely no doubt that these people were all talking about the same book.
And therefore that discounts the hoax theory. Voynich wouldn't have known anything about that letters or those letters. So therefore we are sure that it's not a modern thing that Voynich wanted to do to sell it or to call the attention of other librarians. But it may be a very old hoax.
The letter seems to exonerate Voynich, but it's not absolute proof. So the Voynich mystery is as complex as ever. Despite the efforts of some of the world's best mathematical brains for almost a century, the essential questions remain. Who was the mystery author of the Voynich manuscript? Was it a medieval alchemist driven to writing heretical thoughts in code for fear of his life? A hallucinating monk recording his conversations with God? The language of the angels? Or a medieval herbalist hiding secret medicinal recipes and elixirs of life? Did Edward Kelly devise an underhand scheme to fool Emperor Rudolph? Or was it an elaborate hoax concocted by Wilfrid Voynich himself?
Another taste of BBC 4 on BBC 2 tomorrow, the changing face of Mount Everest, at the same time, 11:30. Over on BBC 4 in 20 minutes, a profile of black British poet Linton Kwesi Johnson.
BBC 4